We're going to get the right deal for America.
No, I think he's a great prime minister. I mean, he could represent me anytime. I will tell you, I'm not saying that because but he could be nasty. He could be very nasty.
If he's a great man and you want to do a deal with Canada, why aren't you?
Because I want to be a great man too.
Mark Carney's second trip to Washington was meant to prove that diplomacy still works. He arrived with confidence, promising a fair outcome for both countries and a pathway to lower tariffs. Instead, he walked into another staged meeting that ended exactly like the last: polished smiles, polite applause, and absolutely no results. From the start, Trump controlled the optics. The cameras captured him laughing, joking, and turning the press conference into a personal showcase. Carney stood beside him, smiling through the spectacle, unable to steer the conversation towards substance. When the event ended, nothing had changed. There was no relief for Canadian steel, aluminum, or lumber. The only clear takeaway was that Trump remained the one setting the tone, while Carney was simply along for the performance. The meeting was less about negotiation and more about narrative. Trump projected strength, using humor and charisma to dominate the moment, while Carney's technical language about trade and investment faded into the background. The American president portrayed Canada as a friendly competitor, but made it clear who was in charge. Carney attempted to demonstrate value by highlighting Canadian investment and partnership, but his talking points sounded rehearsed and defensive. The energy in the room belonged entirely to Trump. Reporters focused on the spectacle rather than the issues, and the contrast was striking. One leader appeared bold and self-assured, the other polite but powerless. What should have been a serious diplomatic mission became another reminder of Canada's shrinking influence in Washington. For Trump, this was political theater with strategic purpose. He used Carney's visit to reinforce his domestic image as the man who can make allies bend without confrontation. By publicly praising Carney while giving nothing in return, he created the illusion of goodwill while keeping economic pressure intact. For Carney, every compliment became a trap, a way to mask the imbalance of power that left Canada begging for relief. The reaction in Canada was immediate and unforgiving. Opposition leaders accused the government of giving away leverage before negotiations even began. They pointed out that Ottawa had already dropped the digital services tax, lowered counter tariffs, and expanded defense spending, all in the name of goodwill, yet came home with nothing to show for it. Across Ontario and Quebec, factories continued to slow down, and exporters were still hit with heavy U.S. duties. The public saw no progress, only a pattern of concessions without return. Even some provincial allies began to lose patience, warning that the government's soft approach was eroding national confidence. Within political circles, there was growing concern that Washington now viewed Canada as predictable and weak, a partner that would rather smile through pressure than push back. The trip was more than a diplomatic setback, it was a lesson in perception. Trump left the meeting looking strong, confident, and in control. Carney left looking cautious, uncertain, and increasingly isolated. The United States had nothing to lose by maintaining its tariffs, while Canada was left bearing the cost of delay and indecision. If Carney cannot secure meaningful progress before the 2026 CUSMA review, the next round of negotiations could become even harsher. The American strategy is clear: use charm to lower defenses, then use pressure to extract more concessions. Meanwhile, Canada continues to rely on patience and politeness in a game that rewards neither. For Canadians watching their industry struggle, the image from Washington spoke louder than any statement. It wasn't partnership or respect, it was humiliation, a public display of weakness dressed up as diplomacy. And until Ottawa changes course, every handshake south of the border will come with a higher price.
Policies that some people thought might reverse under Mark Carney, but in fact have worsened under his leadership. It is more drugs, more costs, more crises, more of the same under Mark Carney's Liberals. And nowhere is this more true than when it comes to food prices, which are in a total and absolute crisis. Prices are rising faster today than they were when Mark Carney took office, promising to lower them.
Canadians were promised relief. Mark Carney entered office saying affordability would be his #1 priority. Instead, families are waking up to a new crisis in the grocery aisle. According to Statistics Canada, food inflation in August reached 3.5%, while the United States registered just 3.2%. That gap may sound small on paper, but in real life it means Canadians pay more for milk, beef, and bread compared to households across the border. This is the reality of everyday life under Carney's Liberals. He said prices would come down. Instead, they continue to rise, pushing households into debt and forcing families to cut back. Coupons, bulk purchases, and skipped meals are becoming the norm. Carney promised affordability. What Canadians got was higher bills at the checkout. The collapse of his affordability narrative is even clearer when we look at carbon pricing. In April 2025, the Carney government removed the consumer carbon tax, claiming this would ease the cost of living. It was sold as a reset, but months later, grocery bills are higher than ever. Industrial carbon pricing still weighs on manufacturers, transportation, and food processors. Even though economists argue the impact of that levy is marginal, less than 1% of overall food inflation, it has become a political trap. If Carney scraps it, the impact is negligible. If he keeps it, he hands the opposition a perfect slogan. That is why Pierre Poilievre's rallying cry to stop taxing groceries resonates across the country. Carney lost control of the debate. What was supposed to be a flagship affordability policy has backfired, leaving him exposed on one of the most sensitive political battlegrounds. Beyond the policy debates, the pain is real. Beef prices surged over 7% compared to last year, the result of droughts in 2022 that reduced cattle herds and pushed supply to historic lows. Poultry and eggs remain expensive due to bird flu that devastated production across North America. Transportation, labor shortages, and currency shifts only add more pressure. Experts can argue these are global shocks beyond Ottawa's control, but Canadians do not care about economic textbooks. They care about the number on the receipt. Their wages are flat, their housing costs are up, and now the grocery bill is climbing week after week. While Carney blames external crises, the opposition delivers a message that is short and sharp. Axe the tax. Stop taxing groceries. It may not be a full economic solution, but it is a political weapon that cuts straight into the frustration of ordinary households. Carney points to industrial subsidies, trade missions, and global partnerships as proof he is working to lower costs. He says new deals in Asia or relief loans to steel companies are about affordability. But Canadians do not feel it. What they feel is the daily squeeze when shopping for butter, chicken, or orange juice. The Prime Minister has built his brand on competence, yet on the issue that matters most, he appears powerless. This is Carney's affordability trap. Every promise of relief turns into higher costs. Every intervention turns into another backfire. It is not just an economic failure, it is a political danger. Food prices decide elections. If the numbers keep climbing while the government insists Canadians are better off, the credibility gap will only widen. And in that gap, Carney risks losing not just the grocery debate, but the trust of the very voters he cannot afford to lose.
Now, all of this comes as Canada looks to diversify its trade portfolio in the face of Trump's tariff. And earlier this week, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a new economic and security agreement with Mexico. And just yesterday, Canada's finance minister held talks in Denmark with European Union officials.
Canada once counted the United States as its anchor in trade. That anchor has now been cast aside. Faced with Washington's tariff storm, Prime Minister Mark Carney is signaling that America is no longer the ally to lean on. Within days of signing a deal with Mexico, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne rushed to Europe for strategic talks. Ottawa wants the world to see strength. In reality, it looks like desperation. Turning to Brussels in this moment is not a show of confidence. It is Canada clutching at a straw, betting on a partner whose own house is in chaos. The move is sold as diversification, but it risks exposing Canada to even greater instability. Donald Trump's reciprocal tariffs were designed to force Canada back to the table. The White House raised duties on cars, metals, and farm exports, confident that Ottawa could not survive with access to the U.S. market. That bet was not wrong. Nearly 80% of Canadian trade still flows south. Instead of facing that reality, Carney is trying to project defiance abroad. He prefers photo ops in Mexico City and talking points in Denmark rather than confronting Washington directly. By avoiding a real showdown with the United States, his government signals weakness. Even allies recognize that Ottawa is reacting rather than leading, chasing headlines instead of securing binding commitments. It may look like Canada is building new bridges, but the truth is harsher. By avoiding its largest market, Canada is putting jobs, factories, and farms at risk. This is not leverage, it is retreat. Carney and Champagne are pointing to Europe as a lifeline, yet the continent they are chasing is anything but stable. Look closer, and the cracks are everywhere. For example, in France, hundreds of thousands filled the streets to protest budget cuts and foreign aid. In the United Kingdom, the government is drowning in unemployment, rising prices, and record-breaking waves of illegal migration. And in Germany, the economic engine of Europe is sputtering. Industry is shrinking, energy costs have exploded, and iconic automakers are closing plants. The loss of access to cheap Russian oil and gas, which once kept factories competitive and energy costs under control, has only made the situation worse. More than half of German companies plan layoffs, while a third are considering moving production abroad. This is the fragile bloc Ottawa is now courting. Betting on a fractured EU to replace American demand is a dangerous illusion. Europe cannot even stabilize itself. To believe it can rescue Canada is wishful thinking at best. The pattern is clear. Trump raises tariffs, and instead of negotiating with Washington, Carney runs to far-flung capitals. Mexico and Europe are paraded as alternatives, yet neither changes the math. America is Canada's lifeline, and China is Canada's second-largest market. Both are tightening the screws. Europe, meanwhile, is paralyzed by protests, political turmoil, and industrial decline. This leaves ordinary Canadians trapped in the middle. Families are already struggling with higher grocery bills, while small businesses face rising costs for materials and shipping. Farmers see their markets shrinking, and manufacturers watch investment drift away. The promise of diversification sounds good in speeches, but on the ground it means uncertainty, layoffs, and less security for workers who depend on steady trade. The gamble is obvious. Carney is risking Canada's economy on partners who cannot deliver. Canadians know what this means. It means higher prices at home, lost markets abroad, and industries caught in the squeeze between Washington and Beijing. Far from strengthening Canada's hand, this strategy leaves the country more vulnerable than ever. What is being sold as diversification is in fact a retreat into weakness. And if nothing changes, the consequences for Canadian workers and families will only grow worse in the months ahead.
The ramifications of a new relationship with the United States are immense. And one thing is clear, we cannot afford to wait this out. Canada needs to do more of that. Canada needs to diversify its trade. The more we can grow our markets, the more we can reduce the cost of business doing in the country.
Prime Minister Mark Carney stood in New York and declared that Canada must be masters in our own house. He wanted the world to see confidence, but what Canadians saw instead was exposure. Donald Trump has unleashed tariffs across steel, aluminum, autos, and farm products. The strategy from Washington is simple: squeeze Ottawa until it bends. Yet Carney's answer was not careful diplomacy. It was a political slogan, "Buy Canadian," that came across as an anti-American campaign. That posture may have rallied some crowds at home, but it alienated allies abroad. The United States ambassador openly expressed disappointment. The business community in Washington shrugged. In that silence, Canada was left standing alone. Behind the speeches, the numbers tell a darker story. Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem warned bluntly that Canada cannot afford to wait this out. He pointed to the risk of long-term decline if action does not come quickly. But Carney's policies have made the situation worse. Instead of reducing costs, his counter-tariff strategy has fueled higher prices. Inflation remains stubborn. Exports to the United States have already dropped by 2% this year. For ordinary Canadians, the pain is obvious. Travel south of the border has collapsed, down 34% by car and 25% by air. Shelves in Quebec and Ontario are missing familiar American goods. Crown Royal bottling jobs have shifted south. Yet none of this has translated into new prosperity at home. Provinces that rely heavily on U.S. trade, Ontario's auto plants, Quebec's aluminum smelters, are absorbing the shock. In contrast, Saskatoon and Alberta, less exposed because of oil and agriculture, remain relatively stable. The divide across the country shows that Ottawa's grand strategy is failing to shield those who need protection most. For families, the reality is crushing. Groceries cost more, vacations are canceled, and household savings vanish on higher bills. Small businesses that once thrived on cross-border customers are watching sales dry up. Instead of a safety net, Carney's strategy has delivered new uncertainty, and the economic gap between regions is turning into a national fault line. Carney has tried to offset these losses with words. In his speech to the Council on Foreign Relations, he painted a picture of Canada as independent, unshaken by sudden changes in U.S. policy. But Washington read it differently. To the American ambassador, this was not resolve, it was provocation. He dismissed Carney's campaign as anti-American and warned that such rhetoric could poison negotiations. The flaw is obvious. Trump alone decides the trade agenda. Carney knows it, which is why he has resorted to appealing directly to U.S. business leaders in the hope they will pressure the White House. But companies in Detroit or Chicago are not eager to take sides against their own government. They want stability, not drama. Carney's message, therefore, lands with no real impact. Instead of building leverage, he has exposed Canada's weakness. The attempt to show strength has become another example of backfire. The costs are mounting, exports are falling, investment is frozen, and the deficit is widening. Carney has failed to protect jobs or contain prices, and the rift with Washington grows wider by the week. Meanwhile, Trump is gaining leverage. With the 2026 USMCA review approaching, he will enter negotiations holding the upper hand. Dairy, autos, metals, every sensitive sector is vulnerable to another round of demands. For Canadians, the warning is clear. What was meant to be a show of independence has turned into isolation. Ottawa picked a fight it cannot win. The backfire is real, and the worst may still be to come.